Okay, well, I'm excited to see Alyssa again. We met last month, and Laticia, it's nice to, you can't see my face because as I said, I'm afraid to like touch anything on my laptop so that I don't ruin this. But my name is Marie Yarborough. I'm the curator here at Acadia in St. Croix. And I am going to introduce our two fantastic speakers today. Alyssa Mount Pleasant is the lead scholar for Indigenous America 250. Following 2 decades in higher education, she established ATW Research and Consulting to focus on projects at the intersection of history and Native American and Indigenous studies that include public-facing scholarship, archival research initiatives connecting Indigenous researchers with collections, and workshops for educators that draw on the sources, methods, and scholarship of NIAS. She received her PhD in history from Cornell University. Laticia McNaughton is enrolled in Six Nations Mohawk, a member of the Wolf Clan, and was raised in the Tuscarora Nation community in Western New York. She is a PhD candidate in Native American Studies at the University of Buffalo. Ms. McNaughton is currently project manager of the Indigenous America 250 initiative with ATW Research and Consulting in consultation with the National Park Service. Her dissertation, Haudenosaunee Food, Health, and Wellness Traditions Recovery, is nearing completion in early 2024. Her research examines Six Nations food history and contemporary food sovereignty practices. So thank you both for being here. I'm going to mute and we're ready for you when you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marie, and Emma and all of the folks at SCUDIC who have made this Lunch and Learn possible. It's been great to work with you on this, and it's really exciting to have this opportunity to present to folks at Acadia and SCUDIC. So we can go to the next. Oh, I also before we move forward, we also wanted to see to add and include on our introductions our new NICP intern, Luz Barranco, who has recently joined us and is working closely with Laticia on our outreach efforts. So next slide, please. As some of you may have heard, certainly folks who are working in the National Park Service are becoming more and more aware of the agency's efforts to prepare for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which is coming up in 2026. And one of the pieces of the goals that the Park Service has articulated through their process of preparing and visioning for this commemoration is that the work needs to include efforts to acknowledge and honor Indigenous peoples. And this is, I think, a really exciting opportunity to bring Indigenous peoples' experiences, the past, presents, and futures of Indigenous peoples into conversations in the Park Service sites in new ways. Next slide, please. So, in preparation, as part of that work, in Region 1, the Cultural Resources Unit developed a new initiative supporting research about Indigenous peoples and tribal nations during the Revolutionary period. And that's the reason why Laticia and I are in front of you today. We've been working since fall 2022 on this initiative to develop both research analysis and interpretive frameworks for the Park Service in Region 1. And we're really excited to be revisiting the experiences of Indigenous peoples and tribal nations during the Revolutionary War period in order to develop better understandings of the past, to advance new interpretations and analysis that result from this research initiative, and also to share new insights about Indigenous futurity. Some of our colleagues in the National Park Service and the Cultural Resources Program have recently started talking about the ways in which our work for Indigenous America 250 may potentially provide building blocks for thinking towards America 300. Right. And the place of Indigenous peoples in this is obviously incredibly important. Next slide, please. So as we are re-examining the revolutionary period and its aftermath, from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, we expect that this will produce clearer understandings of tribal nations on their own terms, and also help to develop new understandings about the emergence of the United States and the American systems of governance. In particular, we're thinking about treaty relationships, and also the development of settler colonialism and the particular U.S. American form of that structure. Next slide, please. So, alongside familiar narratives about the creation of a new nation, there are stories to be told about the persistence of tribal nations in the midst of extraordinary violence, as well as struggles of tribal nations to maintain their territorial integrity on traditional homelands through both diplomacy and also armed resistance. We have an opportunity to explore the ways that tribal nations extended Indigenous diplomatic protocols and practices, and the ways that that contributed to the development of nation-to-nation relationships with the United States. As we're thinking about diplomacy, we're thinking also about opportunities to discuss negotiation and pragmatism by tribal nations in the face of US expansionism. Right? Additionally, we will be attending to topics related to dispossession and for experiences of forced relocation, as well as return. And we believe that this research project and this commemoration period provides a really important and unique opportunity to explore the development of American forms of settler colonialism. For those of you who haven't heard the phrase settler colonialism, it's a term that scholars have been using since the 1990s in a number of contexts, and it's gaining more and more currency in mainstream conversations. It refers to the structure, right? The structures that are created with the intention of eliminating Indigenous peoples and tribal nations. Right? And this is an unusual or perhaps an unfamiliar approach to discussion of the Revolutionary War period, and we believe it's a really important discussion to launch in this context, while also acknowledging that despite the settler colonial strategies and structures, in the present day, there are over 570 tribal nations that that have nation-to-nation relationships with the federal government, as well as scores of tribal nations that are recognized and have relationships with individual states. So next slide, please. And I'll hand it over to Laticia.
Yes, thank you, Alyssa. So I can talk a little bit about our approach. Indigenous America 250 is a community-engaged and community-driven research approach grounded in Native American and Indigenous studies. And I can talk a little bit about NAIS, Native American and Indigenous Studies, and what that sort of approach, methodology, current theory, and sources that this field entails that Alyssa and I are both pretty well versed in. Sorry, here we go. So Native American and Indigenous Studies. Some of the characteristics of working within the methodology and field of Native American Indigenous Studies are some unique approaches, which include working with Indigenous knowledge bearers. Working through NAIS means expanding our definitions and our view of sources of knowledge. And so respecting that Indigenous knowledge bearers have valued input and work to contribute. So we also engage with Indigenous experts who have this specialized expertise, tribal knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, cultural histories, material culture, expanding beyond just some of our standard academic sources that we've been taught, right? Creating opportunities for emerging Indigenous researchers, also seeking out a broad range of sources, as I mentioned. This may include oral history, may include material culture, archaeology, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, and whatever cultural histories Indigenous knowledge bearers hold. Also, an important component, and part of this is through our working groups, is sharing research findings and seeking feedback from communities, and really ensuring that this process is reciprocal and engaging on both ways, and it's a balanced relationship of research, which is really important because of the past history of exploitative research that is more extractive. So NAIS is a real sort of departure from past academic practices, and also attending to tribally specific contexts through the research process. Recognizing that, tribal nations have their own knowledge and their own insights, and that we should engage those throughout our research and come from that perspective when we can. And I'll flip back to Alyssa, let her take this forward.
So, as I mentioned, we started our work in fall 2022 and spent the initial period of the project development establishing relationships with a wide range of individuals, organizations, sites, and starting to, and then and participating in initial conversations with groups that the Cultural Resources Division in Region 1 had already convened, so that we could learn about some of the priorities that, for example, a working group in Southern New England had articulated. Building on those initial conversations and that initial engagement, we recognized that in order to move our work forward, we needed to bring more people on board and develop new positions. So we're delighted that we were able to create a position for Laticia as project manager. We're also, and this year we're in the process of hiring 2 new interns through the National Council for Preservation Education. We're also hiring a program assistant for a new initiative that I'll discuss on the next slide. Additionally, we are engaging Indigenous working groups. This is our mechanism, right, for seeking guidance, seeking advice and feedback, and soliciting suggestions for topics for research. While we bring our own perspectives about interesting research topics and important research topics to this conversation, to this effort, we want to hear from indigenous knowledge keepers, from tribal experts about the research priorities that they have related to the Revolutionary War and its consequences for indigenous communities, and think through ways that the Indigenous America 250 project can help to move those research priorities forward. As part of this work, we are continuing to build relationships, extend partnerships and collaborations. We've been very excited this year to continue to develop our relationship with SCUDIC, and we look forward to next steps in that process. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're also in the process of launching a couple new initiatives, one in archival research and another that was recently funded that will focus on inclusive interpretation, particularly as it relates to data sovereignty. If you could go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we were fortunate to learn early on in our work on this project about priorities that have been articulated by a working group in southern New England. And their priorities include capacity building for tribal youth, particularly in the area of archival research skills. Now, as it happens, my background includes about 20 years in higher education, where one of my specializations was leading undergraduate and also graduate trainings in archival research, research seminars, and also a summer program that I led at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. So when we learned about this priority that the Indigenous Working Group in Southern New England had identified, we were excited to immediately set to work with our colleagues in Tribal and Cultural Affairs to develop a proposal for a summer research internship. And this is a new project for the National Park Service, which often has internships that are focused for Native youth, that are focused on things like trail building and other important projects within parks. This takes things in a different direction, building capacity for researchers and involving Indigenous youth directly in the research process for Indigenous America 250. So we'll be sharing out in February the call for applicants for Indigenous America 250. And this summer we will bring the first cohort of interns to Philadelphia for a 6-week paid internship program, working with primary sources in collections in the Philadelphia area, building relationships with the Park Service at Independence Hall, and also we expect to be building relationships and introducing Native youth to the regional office in Philadelphia as well. Next, and importantly, we are hiring a program assistant to help facilitate this work, and we're also working with an Indigenous woman-led nonprofit based in Syracuse, New York, called Rematriation Inc. as the fiscal sponsor. So there's a lot of relationships, and we think that's one of the real strengths of Indigenous America 250. I want to spend a minute now pointing towards the outcomes of this work. We are working towards, at its core, Indigenous America 250 is a research initiative building towards a context study. And this context study will include a number of component parts: an introduction that provides a synthetic overview about tribal nations in what we know as Region 1, the area between the Dawnland in Maine and the Chesapeake Tidewater region in Virginia. We'll note some themes that emerge through our case studies and highlight new contributions from the research. And we'll also include a discussion of sources, methods, and theories that serves as the base for this project. And as we are building out our data sovereignty piece, we're excited to incorporate research ethics discussions that emerge through that process in our introduction. Because Region 1 is a substantial geographic area that includes the homelands of over 40 tribal nations. We are not capable of providing a comprehensive study that addresses all of the experiences of all of these nations during the Revolutionary War period. And instead, we're looking forward to working with and consulting and collaborating with Indigenous experts who will work with us in the context of working groups to help identify significant and consequential people, places, events, topics, themes that our research group will then explore and develop into a smaller number of case studies. Finally, the context study will include a detailed bibliography of the scholarship that we are drawing on. It will also include selected primary sources that are appended to this study, and will likely gesture towards the important repositories and collections where some of these sources are can be found. One of the challenges, and I think and also important opportunities with the Indigenous America 250 project and the resulting context study, is that we'll have an opportunity to highlight and surface for readers and for the National Park Service, the vast body of scholarship in Native American and Indigenous studies that relates to this project, as well as the extraordinary body of primary sources. There are structural and systemic reasons why most people in the US have very limited understandings of Indigenous peoples in the past, in the present, and in the future. Part of that is connected to the fact that there are only 120 colleges or universities in the United States that have academic units, would be departments or programs or initiatives that focus on the scholarship of Native American and Indigenous studies. So while there are hundreds, thousands of higher education institutions in the country, the number of places where people can gain be exposed to this specialized knowledge is quite limited. So we have an opportunity in this study to introduce scholarship to people in ways that they perhaps have not yet had an opportunity to see, and we really want to take advantage of that through the resource component of the study. Next slide, please. So related to this work, we are building connections with national park units across Region 1 in anticipation of opportunities to translate the research that we're doing into interpretive and educational programming. One of the things that Laticia and I have been saying from the start is that we really want to be sure that in the Indigenous America 250 context study doesn't just end up on a shelf in the regional office. We want to see this work translated out into interpretive and educational programming. And we want to get it into the hands of the frontline Park Service employees who are working at a really large number of sites in the region. And our colleagues are helping us, our colleagues in the Cultural Resource Division are helping us think through points of contact and strategies for bringing this work, this research into the 83 sites that are that provide frontline public history content, and also thinking about the ways in which we can develop web-based resources and collaborative curriculum projects. And I think that is the last slide, other than our thank you. We'd be happy to ask field questions, expand on different pieces of the Indigenous America 250 project that we've mentioned, and are really excited about engaging with folks at Schoodic and also at Acadia. Thank you.
I'd also like to add too, in addition to this curriculum work, we are committed to some of the translational work of helping to turn our research into curriculum and moments to teach more about Native American Indigenous studies. And in fact, this time of year last year, we launched a Native American and Indigenous Studies professional development seminar with the National Park Service, a small section of our region, to share out some of the foundational texts, some of the current research and approaches, methodologies, concerns, issues and topics, things that are happening in NAIS. And just wanted to mention that there are more opportunities to expand that professional development work, and something that we're open to sharing out, and broadening. But thank you. Thanks for taking the time out of your precious lunch hours to sit and listen to our work and what we've been working on for the past year and a half. Just really grateful to be building this relationship with the Schoodic Institute and connecting with so many of you. So thanks. Why don't we open up for questions or more discussion on some of these items?
Emma, are you can you monitor the chat? I turned off my, I don't know if
Yes,
anybody.
I will.
Okay, I see it now. I have a question. It's Marie. Have you gotten to the point of like being able to wrap your head around the mechanism for that last piece, which is like translating, working with sites, programs, parks to do the translation of what that looks like?
We have not yet gotten to that point. I think, as I mentioned, we have emphasized from the very beginning, even before we got started on the project in fall 2022, I was asking folks in tribal and cultural affairs and history and preservation and assistance how, let's make sure that we think about how to get this out into the world. And the world of the Park Service, right? And then also into the world of the visitors who are coming to each of these sites, be they parks, historic sites, national heritage areas, etc. And so, I mean, Marie, you and I met when we were down in Virginia a month or so ago at a training. And one of the things I've been interested in is learning a little bit about how the Park Service actually does its trainings on specialized topics. We've also, as we've been, I think, listening and learning from the Park Service folks at that we work with. And one of the first things that we learned through our listening is that Laticia and I were tossing around this term NAIS, Native American and Indigenous Studies, and at a certain point, somebody in the group of folks we work with raised their hand and said, well, what is this NAIS of which you speak? And that's when we realized that, we needed to it would be really beneficial to take a step back and introduce folks to this area of this discipline, which we are trained in. But as I mentioned, there are not a lot of opportunities for folks to gain access to in higher education. And so we ran a two-part seminar, sharing out some of the foundational texts as well as some cutting edge articles, so that people could become so we could help familiarize people with some of the contours of the discipline. And I think that's been really, really beneficial. And that's the sort of thing that, as Laticia mentioned, we are open to doing in any number of contexts. This might be the sort of thing that's appropriate for a background for people in a particular park unit or historic site that is starting to think about their interpretive schemes related to Indigenous peoples for the 250th, to learn some of the and so that's one of the ways that we're thinking about. And then also, because we want people who are doing this interpretive work to have a sense of some of the basic, but the basic ideas and concepts in Native American that inform Native American and Indigenous studies, as well as some of the sort of basic background information we're realizing is really important. I've taught in higher ed, introductory courses. I've done teacher training programs in a number of contexts. And one thing that I've learned is that very few people know that there are over 570 tribal nations that have relationships with the federal government in the present day. Right. Very few people, and within the National Park Service, the Department of Interior, there's a new emphasis on there's an expanding emphasis on co-stewardship, and as well as treaty relationships and responsibilities. Right. Everyone who works with the Park Service has, as a federal employee, who has a responsibility to uphold, right, those relationships, which have been negotiated since the beginning of the United States, right? But if people don't know that there are contemporary nations that they should be in relationship with, it's hard to even know where to start. And so we can help provide that education, that baseline education, right? I mean, we also know that people who are coming into parks, right, don't have that information. So there's a really important role that frontline public facing interpreters can play with this. That baseline, establishing that baseline information will make it easier and more effective to do the translational work.
Well, I think you'll have people basically knocking down your door, you know, wanting, I know, having a thirst for this kind of scholarship and the bridge that's needed to translate it out within staff and within units and then out to the public. It's something that is sorely needed right from the baseline that you're talking about all the way up through the scholarship that we don't yet know exists or doesn't exist, but will exist and is important. So I know that's the very end, but boy, that's a great end to be aiming for. And like I said, I think you'll have a lot of, I know you'll have people from Acadia like emailing you every 10 seconds or whatever to be, you know, can we be the first people that tell you, can you work with us? So that's why I was kind of wondering if
Yeah.
what your thought is, but you clearly have thought about it. So be ready for when that happens.
Well,
A waterfall or whatever.
You know,
Can I ask a
we'd love
question?
to talk further about that, Marie. And, you know, if you think folks at Acadia would be interested in, you know, doing a professional development seminar, we'd be delighted to explore that.
Hi, Alyssa and Laticia, thank you so much for this. This is Rebecca Colwell here at Acadia. I have a question that, how are you reconciling or how are you dealing with disparate discourses, so Indigenous knowledge and oral history and tradition with quote unquote real history, those archival documents, and how are you thinking about how you're standing those two up within this context?
That's a great question. I think well, one of the things that so a couple years, about 5 years, almost 6 years ago now, I collaborated with a number of colleagues to make an argument, a scholarly argument that was published in one of the key journals of early American history, that scholarship about early America is incomplete without, if it doesn't engage with the scholarship, the methods, the theories, and sources of Native American and Indigenous studies, right? And we wrote a 30-page article, sort of, developing this argument, and then recruited 7 scholars to write full-length scholarly articles that integrated the methods, theories, and sources of Native American and Indigenous studies into their analysis, and sort of as a demonstration, right, of the significance of this approach to understanding early American history. And you know, certainly there is a group of people out in the scholars out in the world who are, you know, less enthusiastic about these approaches. But I think that the work that we're doing is becoming more and more broadly accepted and embraced by researchers. and writers. And I think one of the challenges that we may see is in terms of resistance, right? That you're mentioning, Rebecca, is grounded in the fact that not enough people have opportunities to learn about the scholarship that has been going on for a generation using these methods, right? The article that we published in 2018 was, gestured in our introduction, gestured towards arguments that other scholars had been making, for a generation in the same pages of the journal, right? Of that, sort of premier journal in the discipline. Oh, and I see that Laticia added the citation and a link to a PDF into the chat for those who are interested in reading for yourselves. And I think the work that we have to do here, right, and the work that we can do potentially through professional development workshops, through trainings that are associated with interpretive and educational materials, is to help people understand that this is not new, right? There may be some disagreement, but it's not new. It's well established, these methods and these approaches, right? And we can't, and to move forward from there. And it's not, it's just, it's an opportunity to bring, I think, the well-established work that's happening in higher education to broader audiences, who, because of structures and systems within higher education where there are just a very small number of academic units, people don't have access to. And when I say people don't have access to, that includes Indigenous people, right? That's not just non-Native folks. That includes Indigenous folks, and it's a shame. It's a real shame, because people are left with the impression that there isn't scholarship in certain areas, that there aren't sources about these, even conventional sources about topics. And often the conventional sources, right, documentary evidence, aligns in really interesting ways, right, with the knowledge that is held in communities, right? So there's an alienation, right, that Native peoples have experienced from these resources and sources. Yeah. And we can address that together. Laticia, I thought you were gonna, it seemed like you were gonna
yes, I was going to
add
jump
something.
in and just add to that conversation, and also to the slide I was talking about earlier. There's just, I think there's, NAIS just offers just a way, I think, to enliven our perspective and the depth of knowledge to just beyond the documentary record, because we have such rich resources in our oral histories, in the material culture, our cultural objects, the important material items within our our reach, and not just that, but our languages. Where, and I can speak to that personally, how knowing our languages can also really enliven our perspective and reinterpretation of some of the documentary record, and also the oral histories. And there's just so much there when we just so much there for us, but we limit ourselves when we just stick to the documentary record only. And so, we hope that we can carry these messages in with our work too, through the research we're doing and the work that we're sharing, and that this is something that, sites would be open to. And, we can have more conversations about how this work translates.
Are there other folks that have questions? We've got about 12 people in the room here live, but seemingly shy.
Have you started doing any work here in Wabanaki country?
We have some initial feelers out to some variety of individuals, and related to Wabanaki history, we have been looking towards and this is an outgrowth of some of those preliminary conversations. We've been looking towards the Treaty of Watertown as a potential topic of research, as a potential research topic, and also, related to that, thinking about potential for collaboration with the Longfellow site, because Wabanaki people visited and conducted diplomacy with Washington at Longfellow when he was stationed there. And so these are some of the initial thinking that we're starting to do based on early conversations. But we are excited to be developing and soon holding meetings with one of our working groups, and looking forward to additional guidance about research topics and potential collaborators or cooperators in Wabanaki territory.
Any other questions?
I guess, how did you, you said that you kind of started working with working groups in Southern New England. Why was that the starting point?
That was a starting point because the folks in Tribal and Cultural Affairs and the Office of Native American Affairs, several years before we started doing this work, had convened a multi-year process and project with that particular working group. So when we started, they were finalizing their priorities based on an early process. And so we were glad to be introduced to them and to hear from them the priorities that they set. And I would hasten to add that in listening to that early conversation in fall 2022, or what for us was an early conversation in fall 2022, that working group highlighted a set of priorities that for me and I think also for Laticia, were quite familiar based on our own experiences and work. They focused on capacity building for Native youth. Right? They focused on curriculum, issues related to curriculum and educational programs. They focused on developing new resources and new interpretations that were driven by Native contributors, and there were, I think, two other pieces which are escaping my mind right now. But in listening to those priorities, well, those general priorities, right? We heard echoes of numerous conversations that we've been involved in personally and professionally over our lifetimes, right? And we recognized connections to initiatives that we're familiar with in other areas, right? And so that's kind of how it unfolded. Tribal and Cultural Affairs and the Office of Native American Affairs, as well as History and Preservation Assistance, which created the funding lines for within the Park Service for Indigenous America 250, is continually nurturing relationships with tribal nations in a number of across the region, and working to uphold their responsibilities of the federal government and the Park Service related to tribal nations. And so we're a small piece of that, and we're glad to be able to connect and learn from them and their partners and collaborators about prior initiatives, and hopefully, to the extent that it makes sense, build on it while also developing our own processes.
Anyway, yeah, you have to raise your hand, you can
Oh,
just.
yeah. Last one. What do you feel like is gonna be the most challenging part of the next couple of years in this endeavor?
I don't think they heard you.
Oh,
Could you hear her question, Alyssa?
Yeah, no,
Oh.
I'm trying to
Oh,
think.
so you didn't have an immediate answer, so we are like, no, I'm kidding.
I think it's a really interesting and exciting time to be working with the National Park Service, with Chuck Sams as the director, and of course Deb Holland as the secretary, providing important guidance related to the department and the agency's relationships with Indigenous peoples. And as I mentioned earlier, and keep harping on, there is tremendous diversity of tribal nations, right? There are over 570 tribal nations in the United States. Region 1 has over 40 tribal nations. And so I think helping people at a variety of locations understand the diversity of tribal nations is a really important challenge. Helping, and related to that, helping people understand that Indigenous peoples are citizens of nations. They have a political identity, which is different than an ethnic or a racial identity. Is also part of this, and I think it pushes back against a lot of the discussions in related to the revolution and related to the creation of the United States. The revolution, the Declaration of Independence for Indigenous peoples, right, is a declaration of war, right? It's not necessarily an articulation of freedom, right? And independence, right? it potentially creates a whole new set of challenges for Indigenous peoples and tribal nations. And that is really different from a lot of the messaging that people are familiar with related to the Declaration of Independence, anticipation of the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Native people become citizens of the United States in 1924, right? Just 100 years ago, right? And that political identity of citizens of the United States is not something that members of every tribal nation embrace, right? That's a different conversation. That's a different narrative than the dominant narrative about the revolution. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we will face, right? Is breaking through that dominant narrative. We also have really important opportunities to figure out how to bring people together, bring Native people together, and support research priorities that emerge through those conversations. Okay. To complement the important work that's already happening in tribal nations, in terms of, historical research. Okay. And that, I think, will also be a big challenge, not for plenty of reasons, but one of which is that most Native professionals are incredibly overextended, operating far above their capacity. And so finding times when we can get people together, I think, is going to be to have these conversations. An important logistical challenge. And while that may not seem like something to to raise up, nonetheless, the importance of it's really important to bring people together, to figure out ways to talk about these critical topics and hopefully come to some sort of understanding about priorities. We know from the Southern New England group, right, that it took them quite a while to develop this list of priorities, and we're really excited to build on it and hopefully share it out with, to the extent that it's appropriate, with folks that we meet with through our working groups, to say these are some of the ideas that have already been set forward. Are these good things for us to build on, so that we're not reinventing the wheel? So those are some of the challenges that I think about. Laticia, you must have ideas about
I at times I'm intimidated by just the breadth of coverage needed for the events of the war, the locations, the tribal nations' histories, and just trying to narrow that down into a selected group of topics and case studies. That to me is a challenge in itself, because there is so much to sort through, and and I think our selections, it's not going to be like what's the most important, but it's going to be like what's needed, what do the tribal nations and communities that we're working with, what do they want to hear, what stories do they want light shined on, and Yeah, I think that's one of the, I think that's gonna be one of the challenges, is narrowing down this massive period of history, this massive event into this final product, right? These case studies. But it's an opportunity, and we're really looking forward to telling those stories and sharing those stories with, the skill set that we have and with the insights from the knowledge and methodology in our fields. So thank you. Thanks for listening today.
Well, Laticia and Alyssa, thank you so much. This was fantastic. You had an apt audience virtually and in person, and I know, for one, I'm just so excited to follow along with this project, continue to learn more. I think there's a website, I remember that we saw, at the other presentation we were together in Virginia. I'm happy to share that around with colleagues as well. And just keep on keeping on. We're excited and we're really grateful for the time and effort and the work, and for doing this not brown, what do we call it now? Lunch and learn with us, so. Sorry for my weird inability to put my camera on, but like I said, I don't want to touch anything. Oh yeah, thank you. That's it. Indigenous America 250. All right, cool.
Mhm.
Unless anybody else has anything else, we will, obviously, these two have a lot of work to do, so we should, yeah. We should leave them alone now. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the
All right,
opportunity.
bye.
Looking forward to our next meeting.
Yeah, thank you.